The Burke and Hare unalivings were a series of 16 unalivings committed over a period of about 10 months in 1828 in Edinburgh, Scotland. They were undertaken by William Burke and William Hare, who sold the corpses to Robert Knox for dissection at his anatomy lectures. Edinburgh was a leading European centre of anatomical study in the early 19th century, in a time when the demand for cadavers led to the shortfall in legal supply. Scottish law required that corpses used for medical research should only come from those who died in prison, suicide victims, or foundlings and orphans. The shortage of corpses led to an increase in body snatching by what were known as resurrection men. Measures to ensure graves were left undisturbed, such as the use of more staffs, exacerbated the shortage. When a lodger in Hare's house passed away, he turned to his friend Burke for advice, and they decided to sell the body to Knox. They received what was, for them, the generous sum of £7, 10 shillings. A little over 2 months later, when Hare was concerned that a lodger with fever would deter others from staying in the house, he and Burke unalived her and sold her body to Knox. Burke and Hare's actions were uncovered after other lodgers discovered their last victim, Margaret Doherty, and contacted the police. A forensic examination of Doherty's body indicated that she had probably been suffocated, but this could not be proven. Although the police suspected Burke and Hare of other unalivings, there was no evidence on which they could take action. An offer was put to Hare granting immunity from prosecution if he turned the King's evidence. He provided the details of Doherty's unaliving and confessed to all 16 deaths. Formal charges were made against Burke and his wife for 3 of the unalivings. At the subsequent trial, Burke was found guilty of 1 unaliving and sentenced to death. The case against his wife was not proven, a Scottish legal verdict to acquit an individual but not declare them innocent. Burke was hanged shortly afterwards, his corpse dissected and his skeleton displayed at the Anatomical Museum of Edinburgh Medical School, where, as 2024, it remains. The unalivings raised public awareness of the need for bodies for medical research and contributed to the passing of the Anatomy Act 1832. The events have made appearances in literature and have been portrayed on screen, either in heavily fictionalised accounts or the inspiration for fictional works. Knox was an anatomist who qualified as a doctor in 1814. After contracting smallpox as a child, he was blind in one eye and badly disfigured. He undertook service as an army physician at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, followed by posing in England and then, during the Cape Frontier War, 1819 in southern Africa. He eventually settled in his hometown of Edinburgh in 1820. In 1825 he became a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, where he lectured on anatomy. He undertook dissections twice a day, and his advertising promised a full demonstration on fresh anatomical subjects. As part of every course of lectures he delivered, he stated that his lessons drew over 400 pupils. Claire Taylor, his biographer in the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, observes that he built up a formidable reputation as a teacher and lecturer and almost single-handedly raised the profile of the study of anatomy in Britain. Another biographer, Isabel Ray, considers that without Knox, the study of anatomy in Britain might not have progressed as far as it did. William Burke was born in 1792 in Erney, County Tyrone, England, one of 2 sons to a middle-class parents. Burke, along with his brother Constantine, had a comfortable upbringing and both joined the British Army as teenagers. Burke served in the Donegal Militia until he married a woman from County Mayo, where they later settled. The marriage was short-lived. In 1818, after an argument with his father-in-law over land ownership, Burke deserted his wife and family. He moved to Scotland and became a labourer working on the Union Canal. He settled in the small village of Maddiston and set up a home with Helen MacDougall, who he affectionately nicknamed Nellie. She became his second wife. After a few years, when the works on the canal were finished, the couple moved to Tanner's Close, Edinburgh in November 1827. They became hawkers, selling second-hand clothing to impoverished locals. Burke then became a cobbler, a trade in which he experienced some success, earning upwards of £1 a week. He became known locally as an industrious and good-humoured man who often entertained his clients by singing and dancing for them in the doorsteps while plying his trade. Although raised as a Roman Catholic, Burke became a regular worshipper at Presbyterian religious meetings held in the Grassmarket, where he was rarely seen without a Bible. William Hare was probably born in County Armagh, County Londonderry, or in Newry. His age and year of birth are unknown. When arrested in 1828, he gave his age as 21, but one source states that he was born between 1792 and 1804. Information on his earlier life is scarce, although it is possible that he worked in Ireland as an agricultural labourer before travelling to Britain. He worked on the Union Canal for 7 years before moving to Edinburgh in the mid-1820s, where he worked as a coalman's assistant. He lodged at Tanner's Close in the house of a man named Logue and his wife Margaret Ladd in the nearby Westport area of the town. When Logue passed away in 1826, Hare may have married Margaret. Based on contemporary accounts, Brian Bailey, in his History of the Murderers, describes Hare as illiterate and uncouth, a lean, quarrelsome, violent and immoral character, with the scars from old wounds about his head and brow. Bailey describes Margaret as a hard-featured and debauched Figaro. In 1827, Burke and MacDougall went to Pennaculik in Midlothian to work in the harvest where they met Hare. The men became friends. When Burke and MacDougall returned to Edinburgh, they moved to Hare's Tanner's Close lodging house, and the two couples soon acquired a reputation for hard drinking and boisterous behaviour. On the 29th of November 1827, Donald, a lodger in the Hare's house, passed away of dropsy shortly before receiving a quarterly army pension while owing £4 of back rent. After Hare complained about his financial loss to Burke, the pair decided to sell Donald's body to one of the local anatomists. A carpenter provided a coffin for the burial, which would be paid for by the local parish. After he left, the pair opened the coffin, removed the body, which they hid under the bed, filled the coffin with bark from local tanners and resealed it. After dark, on the day the coffin was removed for burial, they took the corpse to Edinburgh University, where they looked for a purchaser. According to Burke's later testimony, they asked for directions for Professor Monroe, but a student sent them to Knox's premises in Surgeon Square. Although the men dealt with juniors when discussing the possibility of selling the body, it was Knox who arrived at the fixed price of £7 10s. Hare received £4 5s, while Burke took the balance of £3 5s. Hare's largest share was to cover his loss from Donald's unpaid rent. According to Burke's official confession, as he and Hare left the university, one of Knox's assistants told them that the anatomist would be glad to see them again when they had another to dispose of. There is no agreement as in the order in which the murders took place. Burke made 2 confessions but gave different sequences for the murders in each statement. Most sources agree that the first murder in January or February 1828 was either that of a miller named Joseph lodging in Hare's house or a salt seller named Abigail Simpson. The historian Lisa Rosner considers Joseph to be more likely. A pillow was used to smother the victim, whilst later ones were suffocated by hand over the nose and mouth. Hare and his wife were concerned that having a potentially infectious lodger would be bad for business. Hare turned to Burke and, after providing the victim with whiskey, Hare suffocated Joseph while Burke lay across the upper torso to restrict movement. They again took the corpse to Knox, who this time paid £10. In Rosner's opinion, the method would have been practically undetectable until the era of modern forensics. The order of the 2 victims next after Joseph is also unclear. Rosner puts the sequence as Abigail Simpson, followed by an English male lodger from Cheshire. The unnamed Englishman was a travelling seller of matches and tinder who fell ill with jaundice at Hare's lodging house. As with Joseph, Hare was concerned with the effect that this illness might have on his business, and he and Burke employed the same modus operandi that they did with Miller. Hare suffocating the victim while Burke lay over the body to stop movement and noise. Simpson was a pensioner who lived in a nearby village of Gilmerton and visited Edinburgh to supplement her pension by selling salt. On the 12th of February 1828, the only exact date Burke quoted in his confession, She was invited into the Hare's house and piled with enough alcohol to ensure that she was too drunk to return home. After murdering her, Burke and Hare placed the body in a tea chest and sold it to Knox. They received £10 for each body, and Burke's confession records of Simpson's body that Dr. Knox approved of its being so fresh, but he did not ask any questions. In either February or March that year, an old woman was invited into the house by Margaret Hare. She gave her enough whiskey to fall asleep, and when Hare returned that afternoon, he covered the sleeping woman's mouth and nose with a stiff mattress cover and left her. Burke then joined his companion to transport the corpse to Knox, who paid another £10. Burke met two women in early April, Mary Patterson and Janet Brown, in the Canongate area of Edinburgh. They bought the two women alcohol before inviting them back to his lodging for breakfast. The three left the tavern with 2 bottles of whiskey and went instead to his brother Constantine's house. After his brother left for work, Burke and the women finished the whiskey and Patterson fell asleep at the table. Burke and Brown continued talking but were interrupted by MacDougall, who accused them of having an affair. A row broke out between Burke and MacDougall, during which he threw a glass at her, cutting over her eye. Brown stated that she did not know Burke was married and left. MacDougall also left and went to fetch Hare and his wife. They arrived shortly afterwards, and the two men locked their wives out of the room and then murdered Patterson in her sleep. That afternoon the pair took the body to Knox in a tea chest, while MacDougall kept Patterson's skirt and petticoats. They were paid £8 for the corpse, which was still warm when they delivered it. Ferguson, one of Knox's assistants, asked where they had obtained the body, as he thought he recognised her. Burke explained that the girl had drunk herself to death and that they had purchased it from an old woman in Canongate. Knox was delighted with the corpse and stored it in whiskey for 3 months before dissecting it. When Brown later searched for her friend, she was told that she had left for Glasgow with a travelling salesman. At some point in early to mid 1828, a Miss Haldane, whom Burke described as a stout old woman, lodged at Hare's premises. After she became drunk, she fell asleep in the stable. She was smothered and sold to Knox. Several months later, Haldane's daughter, either Margaret or Peggy, also lodged at Hare's house. She and Burke drank together heavily and he killed her, without Hare's assistance. Her body was put in a tea chest and taken to Knox, where Burke was paid £8. The next murder occurred in May 1828, when an old woman joined the house as a lodger. One evening, while she was intoxicated, Burke smothered her. Hare was not present in the house at the time. Her body was sold to Knox for £10. Then came the murder of Effie, a cinder gatherer who scavenged through bins and rubbish tips to sell her findings. Effie was known to Burke and had previously sold him scraps of leather for his cobbling business. Burke tempted her into the stable with whiskey, and when she was drunk enough, he and Hare killed her. Knox gave £10 for the body. Another victim was found by Burke, too drunk to stand. She was being helped by a local constable back to her lodgings when Burke offered to take her there himself. The policeman obliged, and Burke took her back to Hare's house, where she was killed. Her corpse raised a further £10 from Knox. Burke and Hare murdered the two lodgers in June, an old woman and a dumb boy, her grandson, as Burke later recalled in his confession. While the boy sat by the fire in the kitchen, his grandmother was murdered in the bedroom by the usual method. Burke and Hare then picked up the boy and carried him to the same room where he was also killed. Burke later said that this was the murder that disturbed him the most, and that he was haunted by his recollection of the boy's expression. The tea chest that was usually used by the duo to transport the bodies was found to be too small, so the bodies were forced into a herring barrel and taken to the surgeon's square, where they fetched £8 each. According to Burke's confession, the barrel was loaded into a cart which Hare's horse refused to pull any further than the Grassmarket. Hare called a porter with a handcart to help him transport the container. Once back in Tanner's Close, Hare took his anger out on the horse by shooting it dead in the yard. On the 24th of June, Burke and MacDougall parted for Falkirk to visit MacDougall's father. Burke knew that Hare was short of cash and had even pawned some of his clothes. When the couple returned, they found that Hare was wearing new clothes and had a surplus of money. After he was asked, Hare denied that he'd sold another body. Burke checked with Knox, who confirmed Hare had sold a woman's body for £8. It led to an argument between the two men and they came to blows. Burke and his wife moved into the home of his cousin, John Broggan, 2 streets away from Tanner's Close. The breach between the two men did not last long. In late September or early October, Hare was visiting Burke when Mrs. Ostler, a washwoman, came to the property to do the laundry. The men got drunk and killed her. The corpse was with Knox that afternoon, for which the men received £8. A week or two later, one of MacDougall's relatives, Anne Dougal or MacDougall, was visiting from Falkirk. After a few days, the men killed her by the usual technique and received £10 for the body. Burke later claimed about this time that Hare's wife suggested killing Helen MacDougall on the grounds that they could not trust her, she was a Scotch woman, but he refused. Burke and Hare's next victim was a familiar figure in the streets of Edinburgh, James Wilson, an 18-year-old man with a limp caused by deformed feet. He was mentally disabled and, according to Alana Knight, in A History of the Murders, was inoffensive. He was known locally as Daft Jamie. Wilson lived on the streets and supported himself by begging. In November, Hare lured Wilson into his lodgings with the promise of whiskey and sent his wife to fetch Burke. The two murderers led Wilson into the bedroom, the door of which Margaret locked before pushing the key back under the door. As Wilson did not like excess whiskey, he preferred snuff. He was not as drunk as most of the duo's victims. He was also strong and fought back against the two attackers, but was overpowered and killed in the normal way. His body was stripped and his few possessions stolen. Burke kept a snuff box and Hare a snuff spoon. When the body was examined the following day by Knox and his students, several of them recognised it to be Wilson, but Knox denied it could be anyone the students knew. When word started circulating that Wilson was missing, Knox dissected the body ahead of the others that were being held in storage. The head and feet were removed before the main dissection. The final victim, killed on the 31st of October 1828, was Margaret Doherty, a middle-aged Irish woman. Burke lured her into the Brougham lodging house by claiming that his mother was also a Doherty from the same area of Ireland. The pair began drinking. At one point, Burke left Doherty in the company of MacDougall while he went out, ostensibly to buy more whiskey, but actually to get Hare. The two other lodgers, Anne and James Gray, were an inconvenience to the men, so they paid them to stay at Hare's lodging for the night, claiming Doherty was a relative. The drinking continued into the evening, by which time Margaret had joined in. At around 9 a.m, the Greys returned briefly to collect some clothing for their children, but saw Burke, Hare and their wives and Doherty's all drunk, singing and dancing. Although Burke and Hare came to blows at some point in the evening, they subsequently murdered Doherty and put her body in a pile of straw at the end of the bed. The next day the Greys returned, and Anne became suspicious when Burke would not let her approach the bed in which she had left her stockings. When they were left alone in the house in the early evening, the Greys searched the straw and found Doherty's body, showing blood and saliva on the face. On their way to alert the police, they ran into MacDougall, who tried to bribe them with an offer of £10 a week, but they refused. While the Greys reported the murder to the police, Burke and Hare removed the body and took it to Knox's surgery. The police search located Doherty's blood-stained clothing hidden under the bed. When questioned, Burke and his wife claimed that Doherty had left the house but gave different times for her departure. This raised enough suspicion for the police to take them in for questioning. Early the following morning, the police went to Knox, dissecting rooms where they found Doherty's body. James identified her as the woman he had seen with Burke and Hare. Hare and his wife were arrested that day, as was Brougham. All denied any knowledge of the events. In total, 16 people were murdered by Burke and Hare. Burke later stated that he and Hare were generally in a state of intoxication when the murders were carried out, and that he could not sleep at night without a bottle of whiskey by his bedside and a twopenny candle to burn all night beside him. When he awoke, he would take a drink from the bottle, sometimes half a bottle of draught, and that would make him sleep. He also took opium to ease his conscience. On the 3rd of November 1828, a warrant was issued for the detention of Burke, Hare and their wives. Brougham was released without further action. The four suspects were kept apart and statements taken. These conflicted with the initial answers given on the day of the arrests. After Alexander Black, a police surgeon, examined Doherty's body, 2 forensic specialists were appointed, Robert Christerton and William Newbringing. They reported that it was probable that the victim had been murdered by suffocation, but this could not be medically proven. On the basis of the report of the 2 doctors, Burke and Hare were charged with murder. As part of the investigation, Christerton interviewed Knox, who asserted that Burke and Hare had watched poor lodging houses in Edinburgh and purchased bodies before anyone claimed them for burial. Christensen thought Knox was deficient in principle and heart, but did not think he had broken the law. Although the police were sure murder had taken place, and that at least one of the four were guilty, they were uncertain whether they could secure a conviction. Police also suspected that there had been other murders committed, but the lack of bodies hampered this line of inquiry. As news of the possibility of other murders came into the public's attention, newspapers began to publish lurid and inaccurate stories of the crimes. Speculative reports led members of the public to assume that all missing people had been victims. Janet Brown went to the police and identified her friend Mary Patterson's clothing, while a local baker informed them that Jamie Wilson's trousers were being worn by Burke's nephew. On the 19th of November, a warrant for the murder of Jamie Wilson was made against the four suspects. Sir William Ray, the Lord Advocate, followed a regular technique. He focused on one individual to extract a confession on which the others could be convicted. Hare was chosen, and on the 1st of December he was offered immunity from prosecution if he turned the King's evidence and provided full details of the murder of Doherty and any other. Because he could not be brought to testify against his wife, she was also exempt from prosecution. Hare made a full confession of all the deaths, and Ray decided sufficient evidence existed to secure a prosecution. On the 4th of December, formal charges were laid against Burke and MacDougall for the murders of Mary Patterson, James Wilson and Mrs. Doherty. Knox faced no charges for the murders because Burke's statements to the police exonerated the surgeon. Public awareness of the news grew as newspapers and broadsides began releasing further details. Opinion was against Knox, and, according to Bailey, many in Edinburgh thought that he was a sinister ringmaster who got Burke and Hare dancing his tune. Several broadsides were published with editorials stating that he should have been in the dock alongside the murderers, which influenced public opinion. A new word was coined from the murders: burking, to smother a victim or commit an anatomy murder, and a rhyme began circulating around the streets of Edinburgh. Up the close and down the stair, but and ben we Burke and Hare, Burke the butcher, Hare the thief, Knox the boy that buys the beef. 19th century Edinburgh rhyme. The trial began at 10 a.m. on Christmas Eve, 1828, before the High Court of Justiciary in Edinburgh's Parliament House. The case was heard by Lord Justice Clerk David Boyle, supported by Lords Meadowbank, Pitmilly and Mackenzie. The court was full shortly after the doors were opened at 9 a.m, and a large crowd gathered outside Parliament House. 300 constables were on duty to prevent disturbances, while infantry and cavalry were on standby as a further precaution. The case ran through the day and night to the following morning. Rosner notes that even a formal postponement of the case for dinner would have raised questions about the validity of the trial. When the charges were read out, the two defence counsels objected to Burke and MacDougall being tried together. James Moncrieff, Burke's defence lawyer, protested that his client was charged with 3 unconnected murders committed each at a different time and at a different place, in a trial with another defendant, who is not even alleged to have any concern with the 2 offences which he is accused. Several hours were spent on legal arguments about the objection. The judge decided that to ensure a fair trial, the indictment should be split into separate charges for the 3 murders. He gave Ray the choice to which should be heard first. Ray opted for the murder of Doherty, given that the corpse had the strongest evidence. In the early afternoon, Burke and MacDougall pleaded not guilty to the murder of Doherty. The first witnesses were called from a list of 55 that included Hare and Knox. Not all witnesses on the list were called, and Knox, with 3 of his assistants, avoided being questioned in court. One of Knox's assistants, David Patterson, who had been the main person Burke and Hare had dealt with at Knox's surgery, was called and confirmed the pair had supplied the doctor with several corpses. In the early evening, Hare took the stand to give evidence. Under cross-examination about the murder of Doherty, Hare claimed that Burke had been the sole murderer and MacDougall had twice been involved by bringing Doherty back to the house after she'd run out. Hare stated that he had assisted Burke in the delivery of the body to Knox. Although he was asked about other murders, he was not obliged to answer the questions as the charge related only to the death of Doherty. After Hare's questioning, his wife entered the witness box, carrying their baby daughter who had developed a whooping cough. Margaret used the child's coughing fits as a way to give herself thinking time for some of the questions, and told the court that she had very poor memory and could not remember many of the events. The final prosecution witnesses were the two doctors, Black and Christensen. Both said that they suspected foul play, but there was no forensic evidence to support the suggestion of murder. There were no witnesses called for the defence, although the pre-trial declarations by Burke and McDougall were read out in their place. The prosecution summed up their case, after which, at 3 a.m, Burke's defence lawyer began his final statement, which lasted 2 hours. McDougall's defence lawyer began his addresses to the jury on his client's behalf at 5 a.m. Boyle then gave his summing up, directing the jury to accept the arguments of the prosecution. The jury retired to consider its verdict at 8:30 a.m. on Christmas Day and returned 50 minutes later. It delivered a guilty verdict against Burke for the murders of Doherty, the same charge against McDougall they found not proven. As he passed the death sentence against Burke, Boyle told him, "Your body should be publicly dissected and anatomised, and I trust that it is ever customary to preserve skeletons. Yours will be preserved, in order that posterity may keep in remembrance your atrocious crimes." McDougall was released at the end of the trial and returned home. The following day she went to buy whiskey but was confronted by a mob who were angry at the not proven verdict. She was taken to a police building near Fountain Bridge for her own protection, but after the mob laid siege to it, she escaped through a back window to the main police station off Edinburgh's High Street. She tried to see Burke, but permission was refused. She left Edinburgh the next day, and there are no clear accounts of her later life. On the 3rd of January 1829, on the advice of both Catholic priests and Presbyterian clergy, Burke made another confession. This was more detailed than the official one provided prior to his trial. He placed much of the blame for the murders on Hare. On the 16th of January 1829, a petition on behalf of James Wilson's mother and sister, protesting against Hare's immunity and intended release from prison, was given lengthy consideration by the High Court of Judiciary and rejected by a vote of 4-2. Margaret was released on the 19th of January and travelled to Glasgow to find passage back to Ireland. While she was waiting for a ship, she was recognised and attacked by a mob. She was given shelter in a police station before being given a police escort onto a Belfast-bound vessel. No clear accounts exist of what became of her after she landed in Ireland. Burke was hanged on the morning of the 28th of January 1829 in front of a crowd possibly as large as 25,000. Views from windows in the tenements overlooking the scaffold were hired at prices ranging from 5 shillings to 20 shillings. On the 1st of February, Burke's corpse was publicly dissected by Professor Monroe in the Anatomy Theatre of the university's Old College. Police had to be called when large numbers of students gathered demanding access to the lecture for which a limited number of tickets had been issued. A minor riot ensued. Calm was restored only after one of the university professors negotiated with the crowd that they would be allowed to pass through the theatre in batches of 50 after the dissection. During the procedure, which lasted 2 hours, Monroe dipped his quill pen into Burke's blood and wrote, "This is written in the blood of W.M. Burke, who was hanged in Edinburgh. The blood was taken from his head." Burke's skeleton was given to the Anatomical Museum of Edinburgh Medical School, where at 2024 it remains. A death mask and a book said to be bound with his tanned skin is on display at Surgeons' Hall Museum. Hare was released on the 5th of February 1829. His extended stay in custody had been undertaken for his own protection, and was assisted in leaving Edinburgh in disguise by a mail coach to Dumfries. At one of the stops he was recognised by fellow passenger Erskine Douglas Stanford, a junior counsel who had represented Wilson's family. Stanford informed his fellow passengers of Hare's identity. On arrival to Dumfries, the news of Hare's presence spread, and a large crowd gathered at the hostelry where he was due to stay the night. Police arrived and arranged for a decoy coach to draw off the crowd while Hare escaped through the back window into a carriage which took him to the town's prison for safekeeping. A crowd surrounded the building, stones were thrown at the door and windows, and street lamps were smashed before 100 special constables arrived to restore order. In the small hours of the morning, escorted by a sheriff officer and military guard, Hare was taken out of town, set down on the Annan Road, and instructed to make his way to the English border. There were no subsequent reliable sightings of him, and his eventual fate is unknown. Knox refused to make any public statements about his dealings with Burke and Hare. The common thought in Edinburgh was that he was culpable in the events. He was lampooned in caricature, and in February 1829, a crowd gathered outside his house and burned an effigy of him. A committee of inquiry cleared him of his complicity and reported that they had seen no evidence that Dr. Knox or his assistants knew that murder was committed in procuring any of the subjects brought to his rooms. He resigned from his position as curator of the College of Surgeons Museum and was gradually excluded from university life by his peers. He left Edinburgh in 1842 and lectured in Britain and mainland Europe. While working in London, he fell foul of the regulations of the Royal College of Surgeons and was debanded from lecturing. He was removed from the Roll of Fellows of the Royal Society of Edinburgh in 1848. From 1856, he worked as a pathological anatomist at the Brompton Cancer Hospital and had a medical practice in Hackney until his death in 1862.